I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about operational definitions. Would you just start by giving us a description of what scientists mean by operational definition?
Sure. It's the way that we translate what would be called a theoretical construct, so like empathy, into something that's observable and measurable. So, how would we observe or measure empathy? And then you have to think of behaviors, words, measures in terms of a scale, some way that you could actually document what empathy is to you. And also researchers really have to be explicit about that when they publish their study. So they have to say, we defined empathy as, and it's often a place I tell students that you can really look carefully to critique that study because you don't necessarily have to agree with the way that they've operationalized something, right? It's just their definition, their way of looking at it. So I think it's really an interesting place to take a little microscope on a study and really be critical about it.
Well, I know that a lot of your research is on infant sleep.
Right.
Could you, to illustrate the concept of an operational definition, could you take it apart? What's an operational definition of an
Sure.
infant? What's an operational definition of sleep, etc.? Things like this.
Sure. We want infants who have these sleep problems. We define a sleep problem as waking more than once a night, more than 3 times a week. Now, you might, as knowing anything about infant development, you might think, well, for a 6-month-old baby, that's actually not too bad, right? So is that a sleep problem or isn't it, right? Um, I think that's a little low on the end of the scale in terms of what they constitute, what they decide constitutes a sleep problem. But it's like that, right? What's the problem? Um, and then we look at, well, what's the goal, right? Their goal, their ultimate outcome is, let's say it's sleeping through the night. Well, that varies all over the place across the studies. Generally, it's considered midnight to 5 a.m. in the morning, only 5 hours. Some studies have expanded that to 10 hours or 8 hours or so. It's a little bit all over the place. And then finally, the last thing is how do you measure whether something worked? What's effectiveness for a particular intervention? And that gets operationalized all kinds of ways. In many of these cases, I'm looking at it, and the intervention group maybe slept 20 more minutes at night than the control group, right? And I promise you, if you told parents and you said, look, we're going to give you this crying it out intervention where your baby's going to cry a whole lot and you're going to get 20 minutes more sleep, most parents would say, no, thank you, right? They're expecting all night sleep. What constitutes an infant versus a child? Research uses these really broad brushstrokes about ages. They'll say we included infants 4 months to 40 months, and you're like, wait a minute, let me do the math. 40 months, that's over a 3-year-old. I would not consider that an infant, right? They just lump them all together in this big group and they say, oh, well, everybody improved, or really no, more like 60% of them improved. And then you're like, well, who's the 40%? Was it all the babies? We don't know. We have no idea because they've just lumped every, especially when they talk about no negative effects. Now, the idea is it always bad crying it out? No, not always bad. But I also think I'm really critical in saying you also can't say that it's never bad, which is kind of what they do. And when you look at how they've measured or how they've assessed lack of negative outcome, sometimes they just eyeball it. Like literally, they go, well, all the kids seemed fine and happy to us, kind of. They kind of say that. Yeah, I know, right? The rest of it, the big pivotal studies that said there was no negative outcome used this scale called the Flint Infant Security Scale, which was made in 1974, was never peer-reviewed, and assesses security. But in 1974, that was the early kind of concept of attachment. So they were trying to get at a scale that maybe could measure attachment. But the items are things like likes rough play, accepts new foods readily, like doesn't cry when having diaper changed. Like, to me, that has nothing to do with security at all. That's like temperament or development, or so they'd use this terrible scale, found that babies
Oh, wait, was
didn't
it a
have,
parent report scale?
yes, all parent report. I mean, everything has been parent report. Um, uh, they use this terrible scale that nothing bad showed up, and now they say that it doesn't affect security, which many people interpret as saying it doesn't affect attachment. So it's built on this really shaky ground of this terrible scale, and then nobody's really challenged it. It really is important to poke at those little definitions. How do they define their construct? How do they measure it? And then how do they measure effectiveness if it's like an intervention,
Well, thank you. It's clear to see how important an operational definition is and how having a bad one can really lead us down the wrong path.